Pat the Song is doing our session. In the hizzle. In the hizzle.
Yeah, she's probably coming live. I know. I know we're live.
Very sharp. Believe everything you say.
I don't.
But if they think it's
I know. A lot goes on in a year, doesn't it?
Not on.
We didn't, 5/11, we didn't do anything. We did nothing. Yeah, that's right. So like here's how it's going for you guys and me too. It's going like this. It's like Angel desire to learn Moodle, Blackboard, Angel Canvas. Yes. Right? Yeah, everyone. How does this work again? Oh god.
Do you want one of those? Got a red light.
Yeah. Wonder if Pat turned it off. Oh no, it's on. It's on.
Yeah. Okay. It's red light.
Is this working? No? Can you hear me now? No? I guess we'll get started. Can you?
Hello. Oh, there we go. All right. Oh yeah, it's awesome. Yeah. So well, hello everyone. Welcome to the horror program portion of the show, the LMS review. I'm Jeff Swain. I work in Education Technology Services, and I was part of the LMS team looking at it from the pedagogical side. This is Terry O'Haron. He's actually the one who's been leading up the entire search process for the entire time. And we actually have 3 instructors who have participated in the pilots with us. We have Eliza Richardson, Jenny Shook, and Amy Garbrick. And they're here to actually share their experience of going through the pilots and what it was like, what each tool was like, and stuff like that. But we'll begin with actually Terry and myself just giving a brief history of the pilot and where we are now and where we're looking to hit.
Thanks, Jeff. Can everybody hear me? Great. Well, thanks for being here. Some of you may have already seen this presentation from yesterday's discussions with the eLearning advocates. But anyway, this is what I want to cover today. And actually, I want to sort of maybe get through this quickly and actually open it up for discussion, especially our faculty here that actually took the time to actually, well, 3 of them went through, actually 3 of them went through all 3 pilots, and 2 of them have been in all 4 pilots. So, and we're going to get some great feedback from them. So just really quick, the options, the pilots, the RFP. We have an RFP currently out, and we're in the final stages of that. And then, of course, we're going to open up for your questions. Okay, well, these are the options that we have been looking at. Originally, Angel was a consideration because we do have access to source code and perpetual rights to the application, so which is very good. It's treated us very well over the last 10 years where we can actually do enhancements and fix problems. But, you know, with the NFB settlement, we realized maybe it's not an option to continue with Angel beyond 2014. That is when Blackboard no longer supports Angel. As you, I don't know if you know, but Blackboard bought Angel Learning Incorporated back in 2009. And the provost and the vice provost for information technology charged a committee, the eLearning Strategic Committee, which I chair, to look at the options for Penn State in regard to replacing Angel. So we looked at Blackboard, DesireLearn, Moodle, and Canvas. And of course, we're currently piloting Canvas right now. So, some quick numbers on the pilots, and then I'm going to hand it over to Jeff. He's going to talk about our assessment strategy. We applied the same assessment strategy to all 4 pilots. But anyway, here's some numbers. We started the first pilot back in fall 2010. We did DesireLearn and Moodle. And the pilots were hosted by the vendors. In Moodle's case, it was Moodle rooms. But we did not want to actually have to learn the technical side during a pilot and make the user experience terrible. So we just let the vendors take on that responsibility. So these are the numbers for DesireLearn and Moodle. And then, of course, in the spring, we did Blackboard. And then actually, spring 2011. Then this spring, we added Canvas. Actually, with the RFP process, Canvas was not originally an option, but with discussions with Gartner, an IT consulting firm that Penn State has an agreement with, they actually suggested that we look at Canvas, that product, and the vendor for that product is Instructure Incorporated. Okay, so Jeff's going to talk about the assessment strategy.
Yeah, our goal with the assessment strategy was actually to get as well-rounded a picture of what the experience would be like. So that meant we looked at it from the students, from the instructor, from the instructional designers and support staff, and even the help and support staff. Like all part of anyone who was part of the process actually was part of the assessment process, and we collected data on. Of course, our primary focus was the user experience with faculty and students, and you know, what did each interface afford as far as teaching and learning, and also how intuitive was it to use for both the faculty and the students. And we did focus groups, we did surveys, we did direct observations, and focus group surveys, direct observations, and a vendor review where we got the support team together and actually had a debrief done with them as well. And what we found was you know, the data findings as far as hard data points. One of the interesting findings is that any of the vendors that we looked at would suffice, would work. And from our perspective, that was a bummer. You go in with you know, piloting 3 and then adding 4. You want someone to either totally shoot themselves in their foot, or someone to just totally be so far ahead of anyone that it makes it a slam dunk. And unfortunately, we ended up with, you know, the least desirable as far as the decision-making process.
No pun intended.
No pun intended. Yeah, the least desirable option. But it was interesting in looking at the anecdotal data. There was a lot of interesting findings there. It was, you know, students didn't, and I don't know, is there more slides or is this the last one? You know, looking at the faculty recommendations, we really expected Desire to Learn and potentially Blackboard to be really heavily kind of favored by faculty because of the familiarity with Angel, and it's built along similar lines. You're looking at a file folder and tab system. But it wasn't the case. Moodle stayed competitive with faculty. And we had the opposite hypotheses with students, Moodle being a flat interface. We kind of expected it. That's what students, the world are used to playing in, that they would like it. And and you can flick to the student side, while students did show a slight preference, it wasn't anything significant. And the interesting thing with talking with students was that it's like, yeah, the flat interface is the world we play in, but as far as education, the world we're used to living in is the tabs and the file folders, and so where the hell are the tabs and the file folders? And so that was kind of an interesting dichotomy as far as how things broke out. And so,
Good?
Yeah, I mean.
Any questions on what Jeff's discussed? Okay. Okay, on to the request for proposal. Actually, we issued the an RFP back last June. And it's been a very interesting process. And we'll just go over some things that are in the RFP. These are the instructions that we gave the 4 vendors in regard to what we're looking at. Some of them are self-explanatory, but service and higher ed, we actually wanted them to provide some references of their product being used in higher ed, and we did talk to those references. Of course, conformance to the RFP requirements. LMS experience, how much experience do they have in this community? And of course, in structure, they're a relatively new company. They actually started offering their product in February, actually a year ago, February 2011. So, of course, innovation, source code. Now that is one of the underlying business requirements that we are interested in, because like with Angel, we have source code. It's been very useful for us to have source code. And of course, if they're not willing to give us source code to fix problems or do enhancements, then what is the mitigation strategy for the vendor to be responsive to fixing critical problems or doing enhancements? And typically that mitigation is money, but anyway, if that's what they want to offer, then we need to look at that. And of course, perpetual license, like with Angel, after the end of the contract, as like with Angel, we want the ability to continue to use that product. Of course, the last version that we would have at the end of the contract would be our responsibility to maintain and or upgrade. But at least we would be able to continue to use the product just like Angel, okay? Site-wide license, we have 24 campuses. So we want to be able to use this product across all 24 campuses. And of course, financial stability, they're not going to go broke anytime soon, okay? This is the contract we're looking at, a 5-year contract. Of course, one license fee. Typical for a contract, implementation, integration, and training, and support. Of course, implementation and integration. Part of the pilot was we actually did look at course migration, actually migrating Angel courses into those 4 platforms. Let's see, 3 of the vendors actually developed their own migration tool to actually migrate Angel content into the product. Blackboard Desire Learn actually was a beta version. We actually were the first ones to actually use that and provide feedback. And of course, those migration tools are further along. And Canvas has developed specifically a tool to migrate Angel content into their product. Moodle, which is open source, they use the IMS standard. It's called Common Cartridge, in order to extract content out of Angel and import it into their platform. Okay? Of course, annual maintenance support. Now, we did ask the vendors to provide 2 options. First option is they host Penn State for the first year, and then we have the option to extend 6 months, or they host the entire contract, all 5 years. The rationale for the 1 year is if Penn State decides to host ourselves, meaning we own the infrastructure and the staff and all that and run the systems. That's what we currently do with Angel. Well, we would want the first year, to use that first year to allow us to procure the hardware, install it, train our staff, get up to speed, and then after that first year, we, Penn State, would host the product. And of course, if not, and it's cheaper to go with the vendor, they have it all 5 years. Hence, that's why we went with these 2 options in the contract, in the RP. Underlying business requirements, now granted, like Jeff said, the 4 platforms are relatively the same. Of course, we're going to hear from these faculty over here that there are some differences and nuances and likes and dislikes, which is great. And we also got the feedback from the students, but it's also about the relationship with these vendors. What are they willing to partner on, and how well they want to work with us, and of course, how well we want to work with them. So these are some of the other requirements that we want them to respond to. And I already talked about source code, of course, technical database schema. We need to look at that and be able to access that. I already talked about perpetual rights. Escrow. There's been a lot of discussion because Blackboard bought Angel. Actually, a company bought Blackboard just within the last year, and I can't remember, it's a financial investment firm. I can't remember the name, but they got bought out. So, and of course, there's concerns about these other companies being bought out. So we have an exit strategy, if you will. If you get bought out, or you go bankrupt, and the product is no longer supported, we want access to the source code in the application perpetually, so we can take it on ourselves. And of course, I already talked about the site-wide license and all that. Another thing is unlimited users. 24 campuses. It's hard to put a number on all the people that actually use Angel. We got 100,000+ users using Angel, but that fluctuates. So we want some flexibility in regard to the number of users that will use the application. Okay? Any questions up to now on what I've just discussed? This is what we're looking at going forward. Hopefully we're going to have a contract award within the next month or so. And then of course a soft rollout. We're looking at maybe 1,000 course sections. You know, sort of kick the tires, ease into this, do the initial training, make sure everything's working. And then of course between 2013 and 2014 we actually start migrating the university to this new platform. And then of course at the end of life of Angel, which is in the 2014, we're on a single platform. Now the good news is there are some customizations that we've done in Angel. I don't know how many people use the Pollock Testing Center with the Angel assessment tool, but that's one thing that we would have to port over. And of course we have the luxury of, if we don't get that done by end of 2014, we can still continue to use Angel and maintain it ourselves. So now we're going to pass it on to our faculty and let them comment on the pilots.
Yeah, before we open up for questions, let's let Eliza, Jenny, and Amy.
Hi, I'm Amy Garbrick. I taught IST 110, the same course, in Angel, Desire to Learn, Moodle Rooms, Blackboard, and now in Canvas. So all 4 of the pilot systems, same course, entirely online. So we've used a lot, the majority of the tools within each of those systems I've used in my class. My overall impressions are that I like Canvas the best, and Desire to Learn is second place in my mind.
Hi, I'm Jenny Shook. I'm taught Stat 250 for all the pilots except Canvas. This semester I had to drop out after setting up my course due to a family emergency. But the setup was so amazing that I was really excited to play with Canvas myself. I wasn't able to interact with students, but I still fell in love with it. In terms of the other 3 systems, I think Desire to Learn would be my second favorite, was my top to interact with students and have everything work the way I expected.
So I'm Eliza Richardson, and I've taught a variety of different classes, but I've piloted all of them. All the classes, I think all the classes except for one were grad classes online. One of them was an undergrad class that was face-to-face. And I agree with Jenny and Amy. Canvas is the best, and Desire to Learn is second. The other ones either didn't work as well or were counterintuitive or ugly in some way that made it difficult. But Canvas has less of that, and Desire to Learn. So that's what I think.
Cool. Questions? Okay, I'll start here and work my way down.
During the parallel...
I guess we'll start there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
So it's almost April 2012. When is contract
Well, we're hoping in the April timeframe. I mean, I know a lot of people have been hearing about the Pearson conversation. If you haven't, hopefully Outreach is looking at Pearson, their LMS, and hopefully we'll have a decision from senior leadership at the university how they want to proceed on beyond the RFP process that we're currently in. So, granted, irregardless of that decision, our schedule remains, we would like to have a contract award in April with one of these 4 vendors.
During the migration period, and you have the parallel systems, how are you going to decide what courses get migrated over? Is it going to be by campus, by colleges? Any thoughts about that, by disciplines?
Well, we recognize we definitely have to have a transition strategy. Of course, like I talked about the soft rollout, we'd like to, once we have a decision based upon these 4 platforms, we would want volunteers, you know, people that actually would want to actually migrate right away, kick the tires and provide us feedback. But one thing we do have to do is identify those features, those customizations, if you will, that are in Angel, and make sure those are widely available from the standpoint to let faculty know, okay, if you're using these features, you do not want to migrate, you know, right away, okay? But we will be having that conversation. There is a transition committee that we're putting together to look at that specifically, and it could be very well by college or by campus, but we recognize that we need to definitely identify that strategy, and that's another reason why that first year we want to ease into this and make sure we do this right.
Other questions?
So when the decision's made in April, you're saying, how will we know? Is that like will that go out in the newswire or, I mean?
Well, that's also part of our transition plan is the marketing communication strategy. Yes, actually, we have developed a website. I don't think it used to be the LMS pilot website. And we have now another website that's called the LMS Review, and we'll be making that publicly available because it talks about the pilots, how we got to where we are today, and then, of course, announcing the selection of the enterprise LMS.
That website's not open yet?
Well, we have it up. I mean, it's built. We just got to make it publicly available.
Okay.
Is this going to have, is Canvas going to be able to be used on iPad devices? Because I know right now Angel has no support for that.
Yes.
Yeah, actually, all the vendors are either there or frantically working to be there on all devices. And the interesting thing is that it's also in varying degrees of cost in getting to each of these devices as well.
That was going to be my question too, is to what extent mobile played a role?
Yes.
For instance, find mobile to be an important consideration?
Yes, I've used the Canvas on my iPhone and my iPad. At the time of the pilot, Blackboard had a mobile version as well. I believe we didn't use Moodle or Desire to Learn mobile version, but I think since then they've developed those as well.
Yeah, Desire Learn and Blackboard have two versions of mobile. They have the Mobile Learn that's specific to the course management, learning management system, and then they have a campus mobile. Actually, in addition to accessing the learning management system, you can access, the campus maps, the student information system, things like that. So there's a broader type product that they offer. And same with Canvas.
The Canvas mobile interface is nice. The Blackboard one was not.
I agree.
Well, that's a good point. So
To be succinct.
if we can just
Easy to navigate.
digress a bit, if you can
Simple.
just give two things you loved about whatever product, the two best things and two not so good things.
For me, best thing about Canvas, my import from my course in Angel into Canvas worked for Canvas. It did not work for any of the other systems. Now that was, Desire to Learn was over a year ago, so maybe it works now, but it didn't at the time. So that's worked now. I also like the Canvas gradebook. It has a speed grader element that opens up a new window, and you can very easily grade your students' assignments. You can grade by teams, and it has a rubric section where you can build out a rubric the students can see ahead of time, and then when you're grading, you just click the box that's appropriate. It calculates the score. You can give feedback to individuals or teams, and you're done. So I really like the speed grader part of Canvas.
The best thing about Canvas is that it doesn't matter what order you do your tasks in. Whereas with a lot of the other ones, like if you wanted to make a new assignment, you had to remember in your head, oh, this is the one where first I have to go to the assignment, blah, 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 and then I have to remember to put that in the calendar, and by the way, there's not a thing in the gradebook, so let me go and fix that, and whoops, what was the number of points? Let me go back and mess with that over here again. But with Canvas, you never have to duplicate that effort because if you can start in the calendar and make a new assignment there, and it populates your gradebook and the thingy where you discuss what kind of stuff you want in your assignment and how they're going to turn it in. And it doesn't, or you can be in the assignment set and make a new assignment, and it puts it in the calendar. And so you never have to have this task list that takes you all day long of clicking to remember all the things where you might have forgotten to do something, right? That's handy. Canvas has a lot of embedded ways to give audio feedback and video feedback and things like that, which is handy. So.
Another thing Canvas has is the integration with Google tools and some other kind of Web 2.0 tools that was pretty cool. And I like, for both Desire to Learn and Canvas, it's very intuitive how if you want to do something as simple as add a file, upload a file, you can do that very easily to upload multiple files, where in Angel, you're clicking 3 times for each file that you're uploading. Or for an Angel, you're doing something 3 or 4 clicks to do that one of those items. In Canvas and Desire to Learn, you can do the same thing for a bunch of items with 1 click.
In Canvas, I set up an entire course from scratch, and I think it took me less than 3 hours.
Do any of you have
in comparison to 3 weeks, or and then it still didn't work anyway. Yeah.
Did any of you experiment with the?
Oh, the course is already
This was the
designed.
course that existed, but I mean every quiz.
What was the question?
The quiz bank from scratch. So the question was, did the syllabus already exist? When I say I set up my course from scratch, so it's a course I've taught before, but what it means is I had to, repopulate every assignment. I had to make every quiz. I had to do every single thing. Because I didn't export it from Angel. Because I sort of wanted to get the experience of how a person would build something from scratch and how awful that would be or not awful.
I saw a demo at EDUCAUSE of Canvas, and they were explaining how if you're going to offer the same course the next semester, and say you want to have your assignments due every Sunday night instead of every Friday, you can just make that setting once and it'll automatically update the whole thing. Or if you're going to change it from a fall offering to a spring offering, you put in the start date and the end date and it figures out all the rest of the dates, so there's no more instructional designer going into every single course and turning it from January to August. Did you guys actually use that or any of that functionality?
I didn't use that part of it, but there are things like that that make those processes easier to use.
Yeah, I mean, in general, in Canvas, whenever you're faced with a task, the default options often make sense, if that makes sense, right? Whereas with some of the other ones, you're setting a due date for an assignment, and why would you have to choose the hour, the minute, the second, AM or PM, all from different drop-down menus? Why? Why do I? Right? And Canvas doesn't make you do that, which is kind of nice.
So this group's getting pretty hot and bothered about Canvas. Does that count for this decision?
Well, yes, it does count. There was criteria, and of course, functionality is one. Technical, let's see, off the top of my head, I'm trying to remember all the categories, the weighted categories. Underlying business requirements, functional, technical, training, user support, costs, and references. And so all that weighted scoring will roll up to a ranked order of vendors. And then, of course, granted we have a cost now because they put costs in their proposals. However, the bottom line will be negotiations as to, just because they said it doesn't mean necessarily, hopefully they're not going to stick to those prices, but anyway, cost will be a factor, yes. And of course, some of the vendors bundle a lot of their features together, like Canvas, everything like mobile, learning analytics, gradebook and all that, that's all bundled into one single price, okay? Desire Learn, learning analytics might be a separate optional product, separate from the LMS that we would have to, okay, now we got to add that price in. What are they willing to negotiate? So, great feedback, but again, there's a broader perspective that we have to look at. What are they willing to give us the product for and things like that. And scalability, technical aspects is very important. 100,000 users, if the system doesn't work, no one's going to be happy. So,
Are any of these products currently being used at a university as large as Penn State? Just because it works at a 10,000 person university doesn't mean much for us.
Right, right. Mm-hmm. Ohio State's using Desire Learn. Moodle, Moodle's very big in OpenU. That's an open source product, but Moodle Rooms. Of course, LSU is not our size, but LSU is using Moodle Rooms to host their platform.
Auburn has Canvas. Auburn started
right.
with Canvas.
But they're not as big as us. Of course, Instructure has signed on a new customer, but we're not allowed to divulge that because it's not public, but it's a very large customer. Blackboard, yes, they definitely have clients that are our size. But yes, a very good question. Yeah.
Back to the ranking, because these three clearly agree. The other faculty, your slide didn't show that. Did they all rank pretty much the same? That Canvas, Desire to Learn, you just showed the percentages of favorability were, how many different faculty did you have, and were the rankings?
In regard to the pilots and the surveys? Off the, how long is it?
I'm just curious if all faculty across disciplines.
Yeah. Yeah, it was interesting that that with what Amy, Jen, and Eliza are sharing is that while there wasn't a statistical difference, like that's why we did the data triangulation, because a lot, you know, it's real life, and you know, you just can't do numbers on something that's holistic as this. And with talking with folks, and we're still collecting Canvas now, so the Canvas data is still being collected, but yeah, like in looking at when people talk about the usability and feature sets, like there was a definite pecking order that came out across the board. Actually, surprisingly, didn't churn out to a particular discipline. It like came out consistently that Canvas, D2L, Moodle, Blackboard. Yeah.
Yes.
So going back to the migration, say you have a faculty member, a group of faculty members of the campus that want to start early. Are you going to have the campus support up and running? Are you going to allow them to migrate before there's campus support?
Well, that's a good question, because with anything, would that person be willing to accept the risk associated with doing that when there's no support at the campus? So if they're that energetic and want to do that, I mean, off the top of my head, why would we hold them back from doing that? But again, support is very important, because we've got to have that in place to support this migration, because...
And that's part of the overall migration?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah.
Training,
yeah.
training, support, as well as the actual technical migration of the content.
Yeah, and one of the questions that came up yesterday's session related to that, Drew, is that even folks that aren't in the pilot, would the IDs and support folks that aren't affiliated with faculty in the pilot, would they get access to this? And that's, yeah, there would be sandboxes. We're planning on sandboxes with that, and kind of that rollout plan where those folks that
just want to play around,
that don't want to be, yeah, and don't want to be blindsided, because we're the support folks. So we need to know, and you know, we might have the renegade faculty that says I'm in, and you know, then we're like, hey Drew, what's up with this? And you're going to be like, what? No, we don't start till next fall. You can't ask me a question on that until 2013. Or 14, yeah, exactly. And actually, one of the things that we're working with building in the timeline and being rather aggressive is that, because every university we talk to, no matter what tool they went with, adoption was actually a lot faster than they thought. Like going in, the common theory across the board was, you know, from my cold dead hand, that I'm going to use Angel till 12/31/2014, and that actually wasn't the case. Is that people were jumping, and that was actually true regardless of the tool. So we knew going in that we would have to prepare for a greater adoption rate than what we're planning. Yeah. Go ahead, sir.
And there's never really, you talked about having training for instructors on how to use whatever the new LMS is. There's never really been any sort of instruction for students on how to use Angel. But is there a plan to also offer something like that for students as well?
Well, that's a great question, because Mr. Lucas, I don't want to put him on the spot, but we've been talking about actually training students to help train other students, you know, and like in the labs or things like that, have an open lab period where actually students can go in there and ask questions about this platform and how do I use it, things like that. Thanks, Chris, for doing that.
Okay, so I guess going in here, we have some training on not Linda, but the IPS services for Angel. Do we know when or to what degree and if we're going to have training for Canvas or whatever it turns out to be?
That would be part of the transition plan, and part of this RFP process, we asked the vendors to propose a training plan for a university that has 24 campuses. Now, what is your suggestion, recommendation, and cost to train 24 campuses? So it might be a combination of face-to-face, webinars, there's going to be online tutorials, documentation, things like that. It's a whole gamut of options for the training Penn State of this size.
And one of the interesting things that came out that Chris was talking about with other, when we met earlier, about other university-wide services like UCS, the calendaring services, that for a lot of the core entry-level stuff, the preference is like a lynda.com tutorial, and it was for like the more advanced stuff where they were seeing a bigger return with people actually saying, hey, we want training. And so we're even looking at that in the training plan as far as, you know, from the basic to the most complex, looking at existing university-wide services, how are people jumping in, where are they going for those resources, and trying to target accordingly to meet the broadest audience. Did anyone have their hand?
Just another comment about training. Part of some of the questions we asked in the RFP is, can we tailor and modify the vendors' training materials and documentation?
And I will say, as a sort of a plug for you guys, is the Angel documentation was so well done. It wasn't the standard, here's what the vendor provided. It really was very good for how Penn State uses Angel.
And that's what we want to do with the new platform.
Yeah, that's what we're sweating.
Yeah.
Want to go out to it?
Well, yeah, how much we can
Words
build,
are nothing,
because then
deeds
it's gonna
are.
be how much we have to build from scratch with our team, and yeah, that's another Sam's Club size of punch for me. So. Other questions, yes, sir.
Yeah, for the access to the LMSs, will we still be able to have outside members, so people using like Friends of Penn State, to get into those sections and participate with us?
Yes, that is a requirement. That Friends of Penn State accounts will still work, so you can still have guests in the courses. Also, Angel groups. I'm sure a lot of you use Angel groups. Of course, to a lot of the vendors, a group is actually a team. So we had to actually get through the language barrier, because Angel uses certain terms versus these various products. So yes, we want the ability to allow faculty and students to be able to create space, a group, and use that, and add members and things like that.
So groups will be migrated as well as resident instruction?
Yes.
Courses?
I mean, that's the intent. Okay. Now, how well? I mean, honestly.
Or when?
Yeah, grow with us, okay, Drew?
Other questions? Yes?
I would just like to make a comment from a campus perspective. Having spent 10 years on a campus, not all T support on all campuses is equal. Certain campuses get great communication from their IT staff, and other campuses get absolutely horrendous. I happen to be from one of the great campuses. We have a fantastic staff. And they're all graduates of the IST program at our campus too, which I like to plug. But my point being is this migration, this rollout to the campuses, I'm assuming it's going to have to go through the traditional IT channels, or are you possibly considering?
Well, it could be, I mean, it could be a combination of IT or instructional design channels.
Okay,
I know.
we don't have an instructional design person.
No,
so
no, I
that's
understand.
what I'm afraid of.
Well, I understand, but there's an initiative underway in TOT, hopefully to provide some additional instructional design support for the Commonwealth.
That's a great question.
And yes, great question. And but it will be a combination of IT and instructional design to help with the migration transition.
Yeah.
But
That's
very
why
valid, very valid.
Yeah, that's why identifying where people are going for what types of training is so critical. So because we only have a certain budget for allocating the resources to touch all the campuses. So yeah. So other question.
I just want to, something for the faculty up here.
Yeah.
What's one thing that was missing from the various products? Pick any product you want, or one that you would want to enhance, something that's missing. Is Canvas missing anything? All right. I mean, you talked about Canvas. Is anything you change about Canvas or enhance?
You had to mention Canvas because that's the one I didn't completely participate in.
Desire Learn?
I personally would like to take the instant messaging communication skills from Moodle, because that was easy. Students knew how to click a button that said message and then type to me, and then it popped up and I saw it and I could reply back. If they were online, they got it instantly. If they weren't online, it would be there when they popped up. So we didn't even use email. I couldn't get email to work in the Desire to Learn or Blackboard. No students received it, no students wrote back, no students wrote to me. We had to go back to Angel for that, and so we were, doing both at the same time, so that was pretty crazy. But with Moodle, everything was there. The communication skills was there. Desire to Learn was really fun in terms of planning out the course and having placeholders and getting things to work, but the integration in Canvas, it just seems so much more intuitive than all the other three that we had piloted, and it seemed like it was more of the future because you could use video messaging or podcasting and it was all built into the system, whereas the other ones had that as an option, but if it was an add-on or something like that.
Thank you.
Something I didn't like was in Moodle, the gradebook did not function well for me. It did not calculate my grades correctly for discussion activities, and eventually there was...
Is that why all students got A's? I mean,
eventually
we got raving reviews for Moodle from students. I don't know what's up with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Eventually there was a workaround that the Moodle folks found, but that was frustrating because it wasn't calculating that great. One thing that I wish was different in Canvas was the email tool. It doesn't function like the email tool in Angel. Messages are more like a Facebook wall. So when I look and see my students' messages, I'll see a message from a student, and all the messages I sent to him and he sent back and I sent to him. So it's more like a conversation, which is great, except I want the ability to be able to search and sort my email by team or by date or by subject like we can in Angel, and that's not part of Canvas yet. My understanding is that's on the enhancement request, but that's the one thing that I wish, the biggest thing that I wish was different in Canvas.
I think the thing that I like least is something that's shared with all of them, and that is that I'm not really convinced that one giant LMS is the very best way to go. And I think that these pilots don't really speak to that argument, but I almost feel like in the future that's the conversation we're really going to be having.
And that's why one of the requirements in the RP is to allow for, granted, even today, Angel is not mandatory for faculty to use. I mean, and the next LMS is not going to be mandatory that it be used. But one thing that we have put in the RP is to allow the integration of third-party products and plugins, and not necessarily everything has to be working inside that box. Mm-hmm. So allow the flexibility to add other applications and features. And because not every faculty member, college or department teaches the same way and uses the same application. So we've made that a requirement in the RFP to be open in regard to being able to integrate other applications and products.
We have time for one question.
Oh, okay.
We got 5 more minutes.
Oh, sweet.
Okay, so okay, so speaking of flexibility, I was just wondering how, if in the contract it's built in now before you sign, maybe you can add a clause to integrate all the feedback, because we see that the faculty, and maybe you got a lot of feedback from the students. How open is the vendor, the Penn State is going with to implementing these suggestions and changes that was that were seen in the process here of testing them?
We've actually identified gaps in regard to the functional requirements, and of course that will be part of the conversation, and it'll be up to the vendor whether or not they are willing to incorporate those enhancements or fix those gaps or things like that. But things that Amy talked about, they've already agreed to implement that. The course mail, email, even discussion forums, have a threaded view of discussion forums, things like that. They've already talked about fixing those. But yes, so we identified a list of things, and part of our conversation with them, okay, what are you willing to do here? You know, of course, I mean, if they don't want to do them, well, then we have to look at our options.
Any other questions? Well, thank you all. Did you guys have any closing
remarks you guys want to? All right.
Thanks.